in the team looking at designed enzymatic biomaterials. I think it's also worth noting that he has more than 10 years experience in the area of petroleum microbiology. He's going to speak to us today on the title of How Microbial Phylogenomics Can Be Applied to Determine Where Microbial Issues Are in the Upstream, Midstream Industrial Water Systems. Gert, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Where is the... Still here. So thanks for that introduction. Welcome everybody. I will talk today a little bit about legacy work. So I have to put in a disclaimer into this long title that the examples that I'm going to show actually are from an IFF legacy business, but they are transferable to IFF relevant businesses also, but we have not yet examples that we can publish because they have not been published out to be open. So I'm going to talk to you about industrial systems today. And for that I took to the internet because we have to then first define what industrial systems actually are. So I put in Google, okay, industrial system, you see a variety of things. For example, a cooling tower, a midstream distiller, an ethanol plant, an oil well, for example. But what do you see if you look at these pictures? Any idea in the audience? Tanks, yeah, that's one. And the other? You see tanks, you see pipes, you see wells, you see distillers, you see pumps, you see feedback lines. But now what I've been seeing is that they're actually artificially created ecosystems. Because we have very often the presence of water, often feedback lines are present. That means that in such a system the water has been recycled back to an earlier part of the system, thereby creating a bioreactor actually. Often the water is rich in organic carbon because the water has a source. It can come from a river, it can come from the sea even. And often chemicals are being added to allow a smooth operation of the particular process that is being carried on. And each of these tanks, pumps, pipeline, distillers, extractors, holds a unique created ecosystem that has its own parameters. Temperature, its own salinity, its own pH, retention time of a water phase, and often a different redox potential also. And this all indicates that microbial proliferation is a given if the parameters are within the limits of life, so between -17 and 121 degrees C and below pH 11, and if there's plenty of water. And this often leads to issues within the operation of the industrial systems, causing an OPEX hit, because a company has to take their factory out of operation for some time, and this is causing a cost for this company. So here's an example of a water treatment site, of a Blommerton, in this case an oil field. You see all these different elements, gathering tanks, gathering lines. You see a seawater intake here. You see a deaeration tower. Deaeration tower means that you go from an oxygen-rich to an oxygen-poor environment. There is a temperature decrease over the entire system. There are water injectors. You see there are recycle loops. So all of these elements has its own unique ecosystem in that matter. So what are some of the issues caused by microbes that you see in industry? Well, legacy from the oil world, for example, H2S production in oil fields, for example. For fun, after this talk, if you type in, for example, Canada and sulfur mountains, or maybe more funny, the sulfur pyramid, for example, you can see, because the oil industry is injecting so much seawater to displace the oil, it's an oxygen-poor environment where an older microbiology kicks in, where sulfate is reduced back to H2S, that has to be then oxidized back to elemental sulfur. And this is such a big production of elemental sulfur that in the 90s, the sulfur mines in California had to close because the oil industry was giving it away for free. Another one is biocorrosion in pipelines. Any pipeline, doesn't matter, can also be in a fermentative system. Typically, a system is designed with a particular corrosion time, because corrosion chemically always happens. So what this means is that you introduce a system, it is typically designed, for example, to last 20, 30 to 40 years. But if you have now a biofilm in this pipeline, you can speed up your chemical corrosion process by almost a factor of 20 in the case of, for example, low water accelerated corrosion. So if your pipeline costs you $500 million, and you design it to last for 30 years and it's already failing after 5 years, people are not particularly happy with that. So that's one other. Another one is fluid spoilage. In the case, for example, of ethanol plants or starch plants, the spoilage of fluid, the contamination of microbes to be in this cause, for example, a bad smell in the product or something like that. Or what also happens is functional chemical degradations, that your organisms make a meal of the functional chemical you're actually adding. Or in case of cooling towers, very well known is the contamination of Legionella. This particularly happens in cooling towers during the summer, especially if you have high temperatures during the summer. This is a huge issue because you have to take your cooling tower out of operation, and this is enforced by law in many European countries. So what can you now do? One thing is you can make a system map, and you can use molecular biology to do this. So it will allow you in these systems to determine why certain populations become problematic and cause an issue while others do not. And often this is due to how the ecosystem has been designed and how we handle it. So on the left-hand side, you see the geochemical description of the things that we can do. You can look at the source of the water. What is the acidity, the salinity? What is the ion composition? The temperature? Is there a retention time? For example, is the set-through of a tank high or is it low? Are there return cycles? Is there evaporation in place? Do we add certain chemicals or organic carbon? If you do that, you basically describe for each of your elements a particular ecosystem. And then what you can do is overlay that with the molecular toolbox to start with phylogenomics, or the era of next generation sequencing that allows you to look at the population and overlay that with the ecosystem that you just described. Together with qPCR, which can tell you how many of these bacteria or cells are in there. And if you want to take it one step further, we have seen talks today, you can also go into the metagenomics or proteomics area. So we're deploying nothing more than the old principle of Bas Becking and Martinez Beiering. Everything is everywhere, but the environment selects what comes up. And what we have been doing and still doing also at IFF is we can actually add to this later. So what is selected tells something about the environment. And this is particularly convenient at the moment that you cannot open your ecosystem in case of a cooling system, in case of an oil field, in case of a fermentative system. It doesn't matter. So you take what's second best, and what second best is, you go to your nearest tap water point, you tap water, you look into the phylogenomics, you describe the ecosystem, and it can tell you something about what is going on. And for this particular talk, because I have only 10 minutes, I have just one example to show you, and this is really an old example, but it suits it so well. Here we have a system where we have an oil-water separator, where oil is separated by flotation. So the oil-water mixture comes up from the oil field, it goes into a tank where it is decompressed, and the oil is going to float on top, and the water is being pumped away to another location. Now there is something very interesting here in the Dutch legislation, because this oil water is marine in nature, but in order for it to be discharged into the environment, the salinity of this water from which it's taken is too high. So we had to artificially reduce the salinity to an acceptable level by the Dutch government. And for this, we're adding in this oxygen scrubber tank tap water to this system. But when you're adding tap water, it also means that you introduce oxygen into this tank. So in this case, we also had to then add an oxygen scrubber to reduce the oxygen level in this tank again. And in between, we are heating the temperature up to 65 degrees to allow for a better separation. So the same type of water, on the left-hand side 35 degrees, on the right-hand side 60 degrees, where we would just drop the salinity and we added ammonium bisulfite as an oxygen scavenger. And if you now look into the phylogenomes, you see that on the left-hand side, the water that is incoming has a very simple fermentative Marinobacter culture in this blue bar that is dominating the entire population. Marinobacters are fermentative, they don't do very much, and they're often seen in marine contaminated water. So water that is or polluted with oil or has been discharged by a boat in a harbor, for example. But in the oxygen scrubber tank, now all of a sudden we see the rise of thermodesulfovibrio, up to 40% and aquifex. Thermodesulfovibrio is actually a sulfate reducer, and sulfite is actually an activated form of sulfate. So what we have been doing is feeding these guys McDonald's because they don't have to activate sulfate anymore. And what you can imagine is that they produce H2S, and the H2S is highly corrosive to the metal in that system. So the system behind this oxygen scrubber tank was severely more corroded than in the oil-water separator. So I hope that this gives you a simple idea of how phylogenomics and ecosystem engineering, because this change was induced by the chemical treatment that we were deploying on this field, and how this may help you in identifying in such industrial systems where the issue is. And our next speaker, because this is where I will stop, is going to talk all about how to now handle it. So I would like to stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Gert. That brings us to our last speaker today, and it's for me a particularly